Japanese pro wrestling was born out of embarrassment. Unlike its Western counterparts' testosterone-infused soap opera, it was an opportunity to repair the pride of a fractured empire by pitting Japanese heroes against foreign devils in predetermined outcomes. They even tried to make pro wrestling seem legit by incorporating technique and a set of rules to create the impression of a real sport, to prove to a beleaguered Japan that there was hope. But by the time Japan escaped the post-war era, that pride began to erode when Nobuhiko Takada, a pro wrestling star, was hopelessly exposed by Rickson Gracie, a torch in the all-consuming inferno that was the insecurity that justified condescension towards this unusual sport. Kengan Ashura, being the unusual story that it is, characterized their pro wrestler with the condescension usually reserved for outsiders of it. Sekibayashi Jun was a totem of arrogance who patronizingly declared that he was better than a protagonist, because while he had the right to remain rational, it was his responsibility to endure the pain and take every attack head on. This is the part where pro wrestlers get a cruel taste of reality, and are shoved inside of a cannon and fired to reinforce the serious nature of the story being told. Oma made him look like a hypocrite for avoiding the pain of a harmless pinch, and did the equivalent of leading a lamb to the slaughter by doing exactly what we expected. But what was taken for weakness was just an act. In spite of the extreme pain that pro wrestlers are subjected to, they're still expected to keep their composure and follow their script. Alongside requiring an insane degree of toughness, pro wrestlers have to be exceptional actors in order to keep their cool for bouts that can last up to an hour, where they're pummeled by metal chairs, forced to fall from dangerous heights, or twisted in holds where their bodies are bent at angles they weren't made to be in. Therefore, pro wrestling doesn't need the bland respectability of a sport to elicit admiration from a complete outsider. The reality of the physical and mental strength necessary to survive the brutality of pro wrestling was unleashed upon our hero as his flesh was grinded upon concrete and his spine was bending in a way that it shouldn't. But the reality of storytelling is that the hero usually wins, and in the honor of the anime protags that came before him, Oma used a power-up that gives him enhanced abilities at the cost of his lifespan. This is the part where he was supposed to completely overwhelm Sekibayashi by facing him with every fiber of his being to prove that his performance up till now was just a fluke. But it wasn't, as Sekibayashi took every single one of his attacks without so much as backing down, and the one strike that did have impact did more damage to the user than to the one responsible for taking it. Kengan is a story that revolves around unexpected outcomes, and it only became the great story that it is thanks to characters like Sekibayashi who exceed the expectations forced upon them. If we expected pro wrestlers to be anything like the way they ought to be, we would never have expected him to draw strength from his own weakness, proving that with enough conviction, gratitude, and determination, that pro wrestling can be more than legit. Back in Japan, pro wrestling was not the only one to create pride through violence. Of course, I'm talking about sumo. Compared to the scripted brutality of the ring, the dohyo was home to real competition, where fat foreigners were dominated by titanic Japanese rikishi. This was a product of there being limited opportunities for foreign wrestlers to find positions in Japanese stables. But even if it was Japan's national sport, the domination of foreigners by Japanese wrestlers emboldened a recuperated people, because these were real victories in a sport with real competition. But as Japan's population began declining, as its rural population moved into cities, this no longer became the case, as the talent pool began to diminish, and foreign wrestlers were able to find seats in Japanese stables. The Yokozuna, the highest rank of all sumo wrestlers, has in recent years been dominated by Japan's former enemy to the west, the Mongolians. While pro wrestling betrayed Japan by giving a false perception of dominance, sumo was betrayed by the very people who gave birth to it. The insecurity at the heart of sumo is that it no longer serves a purpose for the Japanese people in a postmodern country that has turned its back on it. It is this crisis that defines Kengan's unusual Rikishi. Kyozan Takeru is a ruffian determined to return the sport to its former glory by abandoning modern sumo in favor of its ancient past. But, in another example of Kengan being the story that it is, the man who abandoned sumo, yet claimed to carry its honor, was matched up against a pro wrestler to determine who the real faker was. Insulted by Sekibahashi's classless act, the two engaged in a war for the damaged pride of their respective sports. While sumo wrestlers are not seen as athletes because they're fat and heavy, such traits are favorable when it comes to being immovable and strong enough to shove 300-pound behemoths off an arena so small that immediate explosive power becomes more important than endurance. It's not uncommon for sumo matches to last mere seconds, where even the slightest imperfection or lapse in judgment could spell defeat. The reality of the speed and finesse necessary to survive the real competition of sumo was unleashed upon Sekibayashi as he was hopelessly outpaced, crashing into concrete with all the charm of a car accident as he was mangled with ferocity. But in spite of his opponent's blitzkrieg, Sekibayashi kept his act and refused to give an inch in the no man's land between the two sports that once emboldened a crippled empire. Soon it was the pro wrestler who was able to mount an offense as it became clear that Kyozan's explosive power diminished as the weakness of his conditioning began to show. But war is the mother of invention, and Kyozan innovated by abandoning modern sumo and unleashing ancient sumo to defeat the surging pro wrestler. But spurred on by his own damaged pride, which became only that much more broken when Sekibayashi withstood all of his merciless sumo moves without so much as putting up a guard, woke him up from his concussion with a brutal leg kick, and continued to bludgeon him to make him recognize the superiority of sumo by forcing him to neglect his responsibilities as a pro wrestler. Yet, Sekibayashi's conviction did not waver, as he had faith that his opponent could keep up for much longer, as it was clear that while Kyozan had the body of a sumo wrestler, he did not practice sumo. So, in a moment that could only happen in Kengan, the pro wrestler got to call out a very legitimate athlete for being a fake. Having lost the battle of attrition, both physically and mentally, Kyozan's anger boiled over into bloodlust as he prepared his Hail Mary. Condensing like a bullet in a revolver, Kyozan was launched with blinding agility, blowing Sekibayashi to smithereens with a shot that could have been heard around the globe. But in a moment that proved who the real fraud was, Kyozan came out suffering brain trauma, while the one responsible for taking Kyozan's shrapnel of pure killing intent was the only one left standing. Having once again turned pro wrestling's greatest weakness into his greatest strength, Sekibayashi performed a picture-perfect powerbomb, signaling not only his supremacy over Sumo, but the point at which many of us became fans. On a separate continent, a genuine violence would take place that made the consensual violence of the developed world look fake. The colonization of Africa by imperial powers left a lasting legacy of instability. Of course, this is because the institutions of European states were imposed upon places where there was not meant to be any. But the worst conflict since World War II was not caused by arbitrary borders. The institutionalization of racial hierarchies based on pseudoscientific beliefs ensured that people who did not define themselves by ethnicity found themselves either promoted to positions of power or pushed to the margins of society, fueling ethnic divisions that suffocated the development of post-colonial countries. None more so than Rwanda, where ethnic division between the Tutsi and Hutu people boiled over into genocide. Children under the cover of bush watched as roving, machete-twirling Hutu gangs, provoked by government radio, ripped apart the foundation of homes in search of cockroaches they once treated like neighbors. The Tutsis were pursued into neighboring Congo, but even as they took back control over Rwanda, the Hutus fled in even greater numbers and continued their assault within Congolese refugee camps. Erupting like the lava from a volcano, the breach of ethnic violence was the starting pistol for a period of civil war in the Congo that displaced millions, killed millions, and traumatized a million more. It is this legacy of ethnic struggle and the reality of unadulterated warfare that defines Kengan's brutal mercenary. Muteba Gazinga is a stone-cold, calculated killer who never found a way to fight dirty that he didn't like, with a promiscuity that can only be brought about by encounters with the wolf from Puss in Boots. When he came into the Kengan Annihilation Tournament, the unglorified violence of war was imposed upon Meguro Masaki, as the psychosis of the developed world was ruthlessly dispatched by the brutality of the Third World. How would the scripted violence of pro wrestling fare against the dark totem of savagery, ready to plunge it into the despair of complete blindness? That was not difficult to imagine when Muteba, in the blink of an eye, blinded the pro wrestler, ending the match before it even began. But if it wasn't obvious by now, Sekibayashi is special. Remaining faithful to a creed that would have otherwise been suicidal, he fought fire with water, employing theatrics to subdue terror by shifting his body to neuter the lethality of Muteba's eye gouges. And in another twist that could only happen in Kengan, it was now Sekibayashi who was giving him a taste of his own medicine by making him see the color of his own skin. But Kengan, being the cruel story that it is, one that is willing to subvert expectations, but equally willing to see it revert back to them, Muteba defeated Sekibayashi at his own game, going straight for his heart by acting his way through his onslaught, and unleashing a move so lethal, even a pro wrestler couldn't act their way out of it. Yet, the final act had yet to come. In defeat, Sekibayashi did not give up. The entropy of life had failed him, but pro wrestling did not. It gave him a purpose. It gave him something to lose. It gave life to a brat who would not have made it in our constantly disappointing world. If it can provide an ideal to strive towards in an unideal world, a dream that makes life bearable for a little while, is it fake? Better question. Does it matter? Muteba subdued Seki with his own rules, drawing the curtains on his performance. Just like Japanese pro wrestling conceived a century later, mixed martial arts was born out of embarrassment. Jiu-jitsu was a system of hand-to-hand technique, jealously guarded by the samurai, who were caught without their weapons when the world became smaller, and their secrets no longer remained a secret. This is how Jigoro Kano began mastering an art reserved for warriors. But imprisoned by a frame too small and a body too weak, he failed to realize his true potential as a competitor. But not desperate to make excuses, Jigoro let his disappointing circumstances inform his desires. He turned to sumo, Western wrestling, and other schools of jiu-jitsu to best his more experienced betters, until creating a style so unique that it became unrecognizable. Jigoro discovered that he could leverage his opponent's weight against them through a variety of pulling, dragging, and pushing techniques from other martial arts to make those who thought they had weight feel weightless by throwing them with less physical exertion. This system would be called judo, and it was created by a man who fused different martial arts together because he was not willing to surrender to a world that expected little of him. While MMA has evolved by leaps and bounds since, it was built by people like Jigoro, who were desperate enough to be more creative in their violence. And it is this legacy of mixed martial arts that defines Kengan's MMA champion. In a country too willing to make excuses, too willing to surrender to a foreigner complex to justify their deepest insecurities, Okubo Naoya, a cauliflower-eared comedian whose wit belies legitimate skill, is an exception. Crushing foreigners at the highest level of competition in a sport where he was expected to lose, he met his match in the underworld where he was outmuscled, outpaced, and hopelessly outclassed. Yet, even as he began to succumb to an underworld that chewed him up and spat him back out, he did not surrender, and instead let the disappointment of defeat inform his most pivotal desire: to become the strongest martial artist he can ever be. So knowing Kengan, it was only fitting for the man who now embodied the acclimatized pinnacle of combat sports to face Sekibayashi. Of course, knowing Seki, it was difficult to imagine his opponent having an easy time. Yet, he found himself the underdog. After all, MMA is a ruthless sport that demands nothing short of obsession towards the arts of violence, with each passing generation of fighters birthing the one who could never be stopped, until they find their match and are beaten miserably by another who advances the sport to a new level. In the young sport of MMA, it is difficult for champions to be champions, as young contenders, more hungry and violent than the last, devour the ones at the top as they become weaker and weaker, as the physical toll and competition of the game catches up to them. The sobering reality of being an MMA champion was unleashed upon Sekibayashi, as Okubo patiently capitalized on mistakes and opposed his attacks, releasing the violence of the cage by brutally stomping the pro wrestler's face to a pulp and locking a sleeper hold to signal his return to the underworld. But, in an act only he could perform, Seki muscled his way into Okubo's triangle choke and performed a power bomb which leveraged the effectiveness of his opponent's hold against him by using his own asphyxiation to throw off the timing of his defense. But, even as the two staggered to their feet. The greatest show of toughness had yet to come. Following his first loss in the underworld, Okubo developed a trump card that was inspired by a discipline outside the world of combat sports. Tachypsychia is a term used by psychologists to describe instances where the passage of time seems to slow down in response to stressful situations. But, through a massive intake of oxygen, Okubo discovered that he could apply this psychological principle into combat to temporarily boost his combat speed to the point where he could consistently beat his opponents to the punch for a period that lasts 8 seconds. These golden 8 seconds were unleashed upon Sekibayashi as his tenacious defense crumbled before Okubo's waves of rapid combinations, re-establishing what should happen when a pro wrestler faces a real fighter, until it was cut short. As is now to be expected of Seki, he maintained his ground in the face of an unrelenting opponent, and faithfully followed his duty to take every attack head-on, forcing Okubo to spend more oxygen as his rush began to work against him. And in a moment that epitomized the conclusion of Sekibayashi's story, the man who most embodied the real competition of combat sports was left reeling by the pro wrestler after he had just endured the fighter's greatest technique. Before the match had even concluded, his story had come full circle. Of course, when I say that Sekibayashi is everything great about Kengan, I'm not saying that he is the only great thing about Kengan. But after a tournament which lost the magic of what came before, another with a tepid conclusion, and an overarching plot that seems to provide more questions than answers, Sekibayashi and his match with Okubo might as well be the only great thing about this story. In a sequel that is currently failing to provide a reason for Kengan Ashura's continuation, it is the characters like Sekibayashi who are providing that reason because they never fail to entertain, to revive the spectacle by doing exactly what they were not meant to do. Kengan is not a conventional story defined by high stakes, nor its willingness to imitate life. Kengan is at its best when it does something the world does not expect it to do.